Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the law school, and welcome to the first part of what is a full and joyous event as we celebrate and commemorate 50 years of dedication to the law school and to public service and justice by Frank Askin, our dear colleague, and also our colleague Marilyn Askin as well. Just a word about logistics. The first part of the events will take place here. It will be relatively briefly as we engage in the two more ceremonial aspects of the program. After that, which shouldn't take too long, we will go to the somewhat more comfortable venue of the lower level atrium where the full substantive program will begin after we've had something to eat. So for the first part of what I'll call the ceremonial program, it is my great pleasure to present and call to the podium our Chancellor, the Chancellor of Rutgers University, Newark, Dr. Nancy Cantor, who
Thank you, Marilyn. Well, it is really just an incredible honor to be able to present Frank with the Rutgers Medal. And let me say a little bit about the Rutgers Medal and then just read the wonderful citation about Frank and his work. So the Rutgers Medal is the university's highest honor and was first presented in 1934. It recognizes the unique and long-lasting contributions made by individuals to the university and to the public. Only 250 medals have ever been awarded in Rutgers history, which is good because it's the 250th. And I will now read the citation that accompanies the medal. Frank Askin, dedicated professor and civil rights pioneer, your life of service to the university and to the Newark community has been an inspiration and a shining example of the difference one individual can make. Your role in the formation of the minority student program helped make Rutgers Law School one of the most diverse law schools in the country. You played an integral part in the formation of the Constitutional Rights Clinic in 1970, which is widely regarded as a groundbreaking pedagogical venture and was admired and emulated by other law schools. There are now 15 clinics at Rutgers Law School, and the value of experiential legal education, which you pioneered, has now become a requirement at all American law schools. Your litigation through the clinic to the highest courts of the United States and of this state has been instrumental in advancing civil rights and individual liberties throughout the last 50 years. You have held leadership positions in the American Civil Liberties Union, acting as its longest-serving general counsel and longtime national board member. Your achievements demonstrate your commitment to the local, state, and national communities of which this university is part. You've inspired several generations of Rutgers law students to use their legal talents to advance equality and social justice. Your influence will continue to be felt for decades to come through the actions of your students and colleagues who share your commitment to public service. For all this and so much more, we offer sincere thanks. In deep appreciation of your service to the university, the state of New Jersey, and the public interest, I'm pleased to present you one of the highest honors the State University of New Jersey can bestow, the Rutgers University Award, symbolized by this medal. You are amazing, Frank.
do. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nancy. This is the first time, certainly in recent memory, that anyone from the law school has received the Rutgers University Medal. And so this is a signature event, not just for Frank, but for us at the law school as well. It is now my pleasure to invite Frank and Marilyn to conduct the second part of the formal ceremonies, which is the formal unveiling of the new Frank and Marilyn Askin Clinical Wing, which is the name that the clinics of this of the law school building here in Newark will bear, due to both generosity and dedication to the public service of Frank and Marilyn Askin. So, Frank and Marilyn, I would ask you to come up here. Right. So good evening, everyone. We'd like to begin the program now. If everyone could take their seats. So again, good evening. My name is Ronald Chen, class of '83. I'm the co-dean of Rutgers Law School here at the Newark location. It is my great honor and privilege to welcome all of you, our alums, colleagues, friends at the bar, admirers all of Frank Askin and Marilyn Askin to this wonderful program. This has been the past few days at Rutgers Law School, particularly at its Newark location, has been a time of reflecting upon our history, our traditions, our institutions. Last Friday we had the annual banquet, the 48th year of the Minority Student Program, which Frank Askin did so much to build and support, back at 15 Washington Street, which many of you will remember as the place where you went to law school, including myself. Tonight we are pleased to honor a living institution of Rutgers Law School. Frank Askin, who for the past 50 years as a professor, and before that for 3 years as a student, so he has been a member of this law school community for the past 53 years, has done so much to build the law school as an institution and to build the law, particularly here in New Jersey, as a vital instrument of positive social change. We are astounded and amazed at the turnout tonight. We also want to recognize those who could not be here tonight, many of whom have sent their regards. You saw some of them. Frankly, my colleague Susan Herman, the president of the ACLU, Yael Bromberg, former clients, all of whom remember Frank for the tenacity of his advocacy and the clarity of his vision. I did want to, at Frank's request, read one greeting from someone who couldn't be here, and I'll use an excuse that she and I were college classmates. Dear Frank and Marilyn, I am sorry that I won't be able to attend next week's dedication of the Frank and Marilyn Askin Clinical Wing at the law school. It is such a well-deserved honor for both of you. Years from now, budding lawyers will be reminded of your contribution to legal education and advocacy. All the best, Ann Patterson, Associate Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. Many of you were able to be with us a little while ago when Chancellor Nancy Cantor presented in what was supposed to have been a surprise. Well, Frank will confess later how much of a surprise it was. Conferred upon Frank the highest honor that the university can bestow, the Rutgers University Medal for his contributions to social justice and equality for the past 50 years. And at the same time, Frank and Marilyn unveiled and dedicated the Frank and Marilyn Askin Clinical Wing, which will now house, for as long as we're in this building, the clinical programs of Rutgers Law School at its Newark location. For those of you who weren't there and have the chance, you're certainly welcome after the program is over to go up and take a look at the wing. And if you ask Frank very nicely, he may even show you the medal. Do you have it? We have a very, very full and exciting and joyful program this evening, so I don't want to take up too much time with pro forma opening remarks. But one thing that has been a labor of love recently in planning for this event is the fact that the law school's Emmy Award-winning public television show, Due Process, is doing a half-hour tribute to Frank. It will air next weekend. It will air next weekend, but tonight we will have an exclusive preview. So we're very pleased tonight to show an excerpt from the show, which Sandy King, the executive producer, sitting right there, of Due Process, calls her labor of love.
Great civil rights lawyers, great teachers. Sometimes one can be both. Just ask the students and colleagues of Frank Askin. After 50 years on the Rutgers Law faculty, 50 years of public interest law, changing the way law is taught throughout the country, challenging the law in the interest of justice, Frank's about to retire. An exit that has not gone unnoticed here at Due Process, nor at the nation's highest court.
Frank Askin was in the very first class I taught at Rutgers Law School. And as I anticipated, he was first in his graduating class.
By that fall, they were both on the faculty, and Frank was on his way to a 50-year life of teaching, breathing, living the law.
He cared about the right things, and he appreciated that law exists, or should exist, to serve a diverse society.
A commitment that began long before he was a lawyer. By high school, his focus was on social justice and radical left-wing politics.
When I grew up in the late 40s and early 50s, expressing extremist views meant you were for civil rights or against racial discrimination.
So by 18, he had an active FBI file.
I've been battling FBI for more than half a century, and I consider the FBI guidelines something of a charade.
And while the FBI was watching Frank, Frank was on his way to becoming a teacher, an advocate, a man described by colleagues, students, friends, like this.
There hasn't been a time since I have entered the legal profession in which Frank has not been my role model, in what is my mentor, now my colleague.
Frank is my best friend. He is my mentor. He is my legal partner. He is, my inspiration.
He was my professor. He was my mentor. And he was my friend.
Or, as the ACLU's Ed Barocas puts it,
there are so many ACLU lawyers and civil libertarians generally that have Frank as their idol. And their teacher, their professor, their example of what being a great civil libertarian attorney means.
I vividly recall one day in the late 1960s, after Frank had become my colleague, when he brought a visitor to my office, Mel Wolfe, then legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union. That visit sparked an idea that eventually developed into the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, a venture that consumed my waking hours for the next decade. Frank and I served together for a time as general counsel to the ACLU.
And no one served as long in that post as Frank. So his input's been national, but nowhere greater than here at home.
We have here in New Jersey the strongest protections for freedom of speech, and that is because of Frank Askin.
Among other things, his opening up regional shopping malls in New Jersey to political petitioning.
The Paradigm public place it is clearly taken over what was once the town square or the village green in most parts of our state.
The leafleting case was a frank success, but even when he lost,
If you're doing it right, you shouldn't always win.
he left an impression.
This case concerns a most fundamental issue of contemporary American society. The right of racial minorities to participate fully and effectively in the political process.
That was an appeal to end the ban on felon voting, with Frank as comfortable in the courtroom as in the classroom,
This was 25, 30 years ago.
even when it was the state Supreme Court or the nation's highest court, or even, close to home, an early fight on behalf of Newark's black cops.
The police officers right here, no, we thought we were being treated in a racist manner.
So you find Frank?
We find Frank. Frank listened and he decided to help us. He filed suit and eventually we won.
Claude Coleman went on to be a lawyer, the director of police, and ultimately a superior court judge.
I was the only person that was a student of his, a client of his, and also a defendant because he ends up suing me later on as head of the police department.
Everything he does is cleared with, he clearly does with the underlying assumption that injustice has to be fixed. It's not a question of whether he's able to or whether this is practical. It just has to be done.
That's what led him to a couple of stints on the Hill and 2 unsuccessful congressional campaigns,
I'm Frank Askin, and I'm asking for your votes.
but always returning to the law school, a base where lawyers like the iconic Arthur Kanoy and his dear friend Frank Askin could teach and try to change the world.
He is a firm believer that if the law is on your side, you can move mountains, and if the law is not on your side, then one should move mountains to change the law to do justice.
And so he began enlisting students to help
So you think it's a freedom of the press issue?
I do.
and created a constitutional litigation clinic, a critical addition to Rutgers and a model for law schools all over the country.
Very often law schools focus on describing what the law is. He focused on, and our clinic focused on, what the law can be.
Content discrimination angle, they can ban all journalists, but you can't ban specific journalists.
It's possible.
A place where students can go hands-on in the interest of civil rights.
I'm also thinking in terms of door-to-door canvassing and like freedom of speech infringements there.
And social justice.
Frank's pitch about his clinic is it's a course where students don't just study the law, they make the law. And then he amplifies on that at his first class where he says, you know, in most of the curriculum, what you're doing is you're looking at the law as it is, and you're asking the question why. But in this clinic, I want you to look at the law as it never was and ask why not.
So it's only fitting that what's grown to be an entire wing of Rutgers clinics will be named for Frank and for his wife of more than 50 years, the former Marilyn Klein. Like Frank, a former journalist, a lawyer, and a legal pioneer in the field of elder law.
She is a lion in her own right. Her work on elder law is some of the most important here in New Jersey.
She taught the course in elder law here for many, many years. That was very well received. And as she predicted, it has become a very discrete and important area of practice.
She essentially created the field of elder law. And as the baby boomer population continues to age, they will have the legal protections that are available to them courtesy of Marilyn Askin.
Marilyn is smart, outspoken, determined, like Frank, whose last weeks as the law school's most senior professor found him slower in body, but not in mind, doing what he's done for more than 50 years.
Residents of these private communities have rights under the state constitution, the only state in the nation.
Question, challenge, teach.
Those are a little uncertain.
Bravo, Frank, for your half-century of service to Rutgers and to the ideal of justice, genuinely equal and accessible to all. May you continue to advance that ideal in your life's next chapter.
Frank Askin, that is one hell of a send-off.
I'm overwhelmed.
So we will be able to see the full version of that episode on starting next week, both on Channel 13, WNET, and NJTV. And if somehow you miss it then, it will be available on the website. The webcast will be available on the website, dueprocesstv.rutgers.edu. Yes. So I hope everyone is enjoying their dinner. Please continue eating, but we'd like to resume the program now so we can get everyone out at a decent hour. We have a few people who we've asked to speak about Frank. And of course, we will at the very end give Frank some rebuttal time. So to introduce our first speaker, I'd like to call to the podium Professor Penny Venetis, clinical professor at law, Judge Dickinson Debevoise Scholar, who is currently on leave, serving as the Executive Vice President and Legal Director of Legal Momentum, the Women's Education and Legal Defense Fund, who will introduce our first distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Ron. Welcome, everyone. I can't imagine Rutgers Law School without Frank and Marilyn Askin. It's completely unfathomable. And whenever I mention to folks that Frank is retiring, they say, we can't imagine Rutgers Law School without Frank. So we will miss you tremendously. I have the very easy task of introducing someone who needs no introduction at all. The one and the only Justice Virginia Long, or as Frank calls her, Ginny. Justice Long was one of 4 women students in the Rutgers Law School graduating class of 1966. She paved the way for every woman law school attending Rutgers Law School today, and also she paved the way for me, someone who's been practicing law for nearly 30 years. Justice Long went from suffering indignities of being called honey and sweetie and pretty by judges, co-counsel, and opposing counsel, even in front of juries, to having to work with court personnel who refused to work with her because she was a woman judge, to becoming one of the most powerful people in the state of New Jersey as a member of the New Jersey Supreme Court, where she served from 1999 to 2012. Her 3,000 judicial opinions left a profound impact not only on New Jersey, but also throughout the nation. Justice Long's decisions related to school funding, sexual abuse of clergy, recognizing the rights of non-biological gay parents, and her opposition to the death penalty changed the legal landscape of this country's jurisprudence. Because she has spent her career moving the law in the direction of equality and justice, and because she applied the Constitution to today's challenges in a way that recognizes human dignity, and because she was the conscience of the New Jersey Supreme Court, she is the perfect person to introduce Frank Askin, her law school classmate, her friend, and her intellectual and moral twin. Justice Long?
I am so happy to be here tonight at this wonderful event, honoring my dear friend and my former classmate, distinguished Professor Frank Askin. What an occasion, the Rutgers Medal and the Frank and Marilyn Askin Clinical Wing. Now, frankly, when I was asked to speak, I hesitated a little bit, not for any lack of enthusiasm for Frank, who I adore, but because I know intimately the nature of the retirement speech for a legal figure. Actually, there's only one single retirement speech that simply is given at everyone's retirement, just changing the name of the person. The person is called a lawyer's lawyer, a judge's judge, a seer of the law, Brandeis Redux, or even a little learned hand, when a little learned would probably be more apt. Luckily, such speeches are doomed to oblivion, to float on the river of forgetfulness, and that is why they can be recycled again and again. My problem is that, in Frank's case, it is all true. What a life from the very beginning. As he recently told the Law Journal, and you saw a little of this in the film before, I was a community organizer in my native city of Baltimore. I belonged to the radical youth movement, the Communist Party of Baltimore headquarters. I went there and tried to become a member, and I became a target of the J. Edgar Hoover administration. I figured, he says, I would never get into law school, so I dropped out of college. During that period, he continued to attempt to influence public policy by public acts, gathering petitions, organizing demonstrations, writing and disseminating printed materials, reporting for newspapers and magazines, and running political campaigns. Frank, I have to tell you, my parents would have called you an outside agitator, and not in a good way. In 1963, he entered Rutgers Law School, my class, here in Newark, without an undergraduate degree, which tells you something about who the man is. It was very unusual. He was a star here, and a star is the only way to describe him. And he was appointed to the faculty upon graduating with the highest honors in 1966, and he's been here ever since. Frank describes his passage from layperson to lawyer this way: my law degree and bar admissions were a passport to the inner sanctum of the law, where sat judges who had the authority and power to actually order new rules for governance. And with those rules for governance poll star in 1970, Frank established the Rutgers Constitutional Litigation Clinic. Under his guidance, the clinic students litigated the first police surveillance cases in the nation, battled the FBI over the investigation and maintenance of files on our fellow citizens, defended affirmative action programs up to the United States Supreme Court, challenged the New Jersey State Police for stopping and searching long-haired travelers, argued for the homeless to vote and to have access to public library facilities, and protected the rights of grassroots advocacy groups to take their messages door to door and to privately owned shopping malls. In the clinics, Frank nurtured generations of public interest lawyers. What is the old phrase? Give a man a fish and he will eat for a day. Teach him how to fish and he will eat for a lifetime. Frank taught those students how to fish, and their work has continued to resonate in our society, ever widening concentric circles seeking equality and social justice for all. With his clinic students, Frank has pursued the Founding Fathers' ideals by compelling our public institutions to understand that they serve the people and not the other way around, by reminding judges that the robe is a cross and not a crown, and by forcing the government to understand that its purpose is to allow the people to think what they want and to say what they think. By his teaching, he has lit a fire far beyond what the world could expect from any one person. Frank's wide-ranging career has involved him in issues as extraordinary as Askin and Iran-Contra. He presented the nuclear freeze proposal during the platform fight at the Democratic National Convention in 1980. He's been a candidate for Congress, and he has served as one of the ACLU's 3 general counsel since 1976, and he even, with all of that, got around to publishing a wonderful memoir aptly entitled Defending Rights, A Life in Law and Politics. In his pursuits, Frank has been amazingly successful, and yet, as he acknowledges, he has lost as often as he has won. But as Montaigne observed, there are defeats more triumphant than victories. Our mettle is measured not by how often we prevail, but by the unendingness of our struggle. Abe Lincoln put it this way: I am not bound to win, but I am bound to be true. I am not bound to succeed, but I am bound to live up to the light that I have. Frank Askin has lived up to his light at every turn, in every setting, every single day. But merely recounting his professional triumphs says too little. To be sure, they underscore his boundless intellectual capacity. The world that he has conquered has required brilliance and scholarship, but much more than that needs to be said to describe him in full. Through it all, battling the bureaucratic inaction and even wrongdoing, raging against the machine, he has never, despite what he has seen, become jaded or cynical. He remains to this day an optimist in the truest sense of the word. Dietrich Bonhoeffer described it this way: he takes no account of the present except as a source of inspiration, of vitality and hope where others have given up. It enables him to lay claim to the future. Importantly, he can still be outraged. Indeed, he has never suffered from burnout, a problem in professions like ours, the currency of which is often matters of human suffering. After 50 years of fighting the good fight, he still has 20/20 vision where injustice is concerned. And his instincts remain unerring. If there is an issue of note, Frank is on the right side, even if it's not popular, even if it subjects him to public obloquy. Justice Holmes described the law as a witness and external deposit of our moral life. Without a moral compass, an inner light, all the scholarship and erudition in the world are worthless. That is why so many brilliant stars in the legal universe have burned out and left no legacy. It is only that unerring instinct for good, coupled with scholarship and erudition, that can and has made Frank Askin not a little learned, but a little learned hand. And he has an entirely generous spirit. It tells you so much about a person, that he has friends for a whole lifetime, and that he has left behind him an army of admirers whose warm feelings toward him have never diminished. He is a great and easy laugher, generous and hearty, not sarcastic or mean-spirited, and not at another person's expense. A famous Russian novelist tells us that to get a glimpse inside the human soul, you should watch a person laugh, and it is true of Frank. So is he perfect? Well, Marilyn, I'm going to leave that up to you, right? No, he's not perfect. He's not thrilled with fools and even less with knaves. He can be edgy when confronted with one in or out of the courtroom. If you treat one of his family badly, and I'm not just talking about his biological family, but also his Rutgers family, he will hold a grudge. And let's face it, as the very voice of New Jersey law, called upon by media to comment regularly on obscure and arcane legal subjects, he does so with relish, whether he knows anything about the subject or not. But what small imperfections they are. And it is true, most really true, that he has not gone it alone. There was a power behind his throne. He has been blessed with a secret weapon, the amazing and beautiful Marilyn, who he met in a newsroom, his very own front page story. She has not only been his wingman all the way, but she has had her own career, amazing career, as mother, teacher, journalist, lawyer, leader of New Jersey Women Lawyers, president of the state AARP, and executive council member, always doing the right thing for the right reason, a true force for good in her own right in the elder law community. Frank and Marilyn have, while pursuing their commitment to justice, managed to reach an angle of personal repose with a warm and rich family life. They are reckless and spendthrift in their pride and love of their children and grandchildren, and Frank even has time for bridge. In faith communities of every denomination where a member has taken a vow of conduct, whether it be poverty, obedience, chastity, Bible study, care of the sick, whatever, and that person has comported himself at every turn and in every circumstance in accordance with his promise, the highest compliment that is bestowed upon him is that he has lived the life. Well, Frank Askin has lived the life. He has held himself to an ideal of conduct when it was inconvenient and unprofitable. He could easily have had a great financial success in the private sector, but that was not his calling. He was called to be a public interest lawyer, true to the ideals of Jefferson and Madison, and he has lived in accordance with Aristotle's prescription that to become just, we cannot merely think just thoughts, but we must translate those thoughts into just actions. In some South American countries, it is said that a person is judged by the way that he or she dies. Here, we judge people by the way that they live. In demonstrating and organizing, in his challenges to the status quo, in running for public office, and perhaps most of all, in his teaching generations of law students to proudly wield the banner of reform, Frank Askin stands as a paradigm of what all of us should aspire to be. For the good that he has done, he will remain emblazoned in the hearts of the Rutgers family forever. It is he that Oliver Wendell Holmes had in mind when he said, "Such a person knows that 100 years after he is dead, men who have never heard of him will be moving to the measure of his thought." Godspeed, Frank.
Thank you so much, Justice Long. Representing Frank's former students, I'm very pleased that Danita Judge, class of 2003, was able to be with us tonight. She is, as I said, a 2003 graduate of the law school where she was a student in the Constitutional Litigation Clinic and a Canois Davis Fellow. After she graduated, Danita followed the paradigm that Frank helped set by serving as a senior attorney at the Advancement Project in Washington, D.C., where she is at this very moment combating voter suppression in the organization's Power and Democracy program. Danita.
Thank you very much, Ron. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It is an honor to represent the thousands of law students whose legal careers have been advanced through the teachings of Frank Askin and formation of the Constitutional Rights Clinic in 1970. I recall the first time I interacted with Frank one-on-one. Frank had come down to the atrium, this area where we're all seated, to look for me. As we were going upstairs to the clinic, he asked me about my property grade, which was non-impressive. He then asked me a question. He says, I don't know whether you are analytical. And I thought it was a trick question, so I said to Frank, I said, are analytical skills inherent or are they learned? Frank then turned to me and said, I don't know. I said, well, if they're inherent, I can't promise you anything. But if they're learned, I got this, Frank. Frank then turned to me and awarded me the Canois Davis Fellowship. That fellowship has been a defining moment, or was a defining moment in my legal career. I tell you this story because I'm not sure whether what I said to Frank was the correct answer, but I know that from that day forward, we developed a mutual respect. I cannot tell you how many times Frank referenced the importance of footnote 4 in the Supreme Court of the United States Caroline Products case. This case, which heightened judicial scrutiny for legislation found to discriminate against people of color, particularly when it comes to burdening the right to vote, Frank was repetitive, and I got it. As a voting rights attorney, I understand the importance of strict scrutiny when challenging equal protection under the 14th Amendment for voters of color. Thank you, Frank. Almost 4 years ago, the National Board of the ACLU adopted new standards to increase diversity on the National Board. Frank Askin was one of the longest-serving, most respected, and influential members of the National Board. Frank took an unprecedented position. He gave up his seat, and he nominated me to represent him. This selfless act is just one of the few acts that students have come to know from Frank, his selflessness when it comes to giving and teaching students. But for Frank, I would not have had many of the opportunities that I have today. I am internally grateful for his support. I will miss Frank at Rutgers Law School, but I will remember his teachings whenever I enter the Frank and Marilyn Askin Clinical Wing. This is not goodbye, Frank. This is simply a dedication and a thank you for all that you have done during your 50 years at Rutgers Newark People's Electric Law School. I will be seeing you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danita. Our next speaker comes to us representing a variety of perspectives. I suppose ostensibly it is representing the biological Askin family, but he is also a professional colleague as a professor of law at Brooklyn Law School, where he founded the Brooklyn Law School Incubator and Policy Clinic. He is also a 1990 graduate of this law school. I well remember his first year was my first year back on the faculty, so I saw him usually at first-year parties. But that also entitles him to speak. But on behalf of the Askin family, Professor Jonathan Askin.
So candidly, I have to say, I look around the room and I see a lot of people here who probably know the public facts of my parents' life better than I. I was a child through a lot of it, so a lot of my knowledge comes from a child's eyes. So I was trying to figure out a way in which I could add my own unique perspective on their lives, and what they've done to me, to you all. And I started to reminisce about my time growing up in Newark and my time growing up at Rutgers. And I started, I got to get my notes. I started thinking about my favorite and perhaps not so favorite moments in Newark and Rutgers. And let's say I thought about the riots. My first real memory of Newark, the summer we hid behind a wall all summer long while the tanks rolled down the street. Maybe not the one I wanted to remember most. Thought about the time in Branch Brook Park when my sister's sled was stolen, and she said to the thieves that her big cousin Tony over there was going to come over and beat them up, and Tony said, "I certainly will not." I thought about the year I was not allowed to go to school because my parents were union activists and refused to break the strike. Bad year for my education. I watched a lot of Hercules, but a fun year. I thought about tingling in the Italian ices. I thought about the law school babysitters. Are there any of my law school babysitters in the room? No. Okay. I thought about growing up beside my dad's poker game, which frankly could have led me on a very different, more wayward, more morally bankrupt, culturally bankrupt path had it not been for Rutgers saving me after my wayward year in Vegas. I thought about the time we spent in the colonnades, and one of the great moments of my life was actually when they refused to renew our lease in the colonnades because my parents tried to form a tenants union. We had to move into the wonderful house of the Bloom-Rosens in South Orange, one of the great years of my life. I thought about my time on law review. Really not one of my greatest memories of Rutgers and Newark. When I thought back, the memory I had most fondly was, frankly, the moments when my parents came home. To be candid, they didn't come home that much. They were so inspired and passionate and committed to what they were doing that we didn't get to see much of them. But their absence inspired us. But our great moments were when they came home and our dad would come into our room and he would usually tell us stories about Johnny Cat, Andy Cat, and Danny Cat and our antics for the day. But my favorite moments were when he read Dr. Seuss to us. So I thought this is a moment in which I should hearken back, and what I can do is read a little ballad, the ballad of Marilyn and Frank Askin, with apologies to Dr. Seuss, with apologies to the other great poet balladeers out there, with apologies to my parents, and with apologies to all of you. So bear with me as we go through the ballad of Marilyn and Frank Askin. I'll try to do it slowly so you can see some of the pictures. Let's see. What's the trick here? Is there a... How do I move it down? Okay. How do I back it up? Can I back it up? All right. All right, I'll start here. You're all going to have to bear with me through the first two stanzas. This prodigal son returns home. That's okay. Thanks. This prodigal son returns home today to pay tribute to parents who never could stray. From Rutgers, the school where they studied and taught, and fought for our rights with their heart, soul, and thought. Frank was a 1L the day I was born, in Ruth Ginsburg's Civ Pro class, so he was naturally torn. Learn res judicata or race to mom's bed. He stayed at the school. Ex post facto he pled. Quasi and rem control of his son. That argument's flawed, not sure how he won. Frank's won many battles that were quixotic at best. Free speech and surveillance, he's helped write the test. I remember Dad graduating, Dean Heckel spoke loud. I cried at his voice, but Mom was so proud. She was next to the bar with Heckel still Dean, but I learned my lesson and made less of a scene. The People's Electric Law School was an intense breeding ground. For these fresh-minted lawyers, profound issues abound. Tanks rolled down the streets while Newark was burning. The riots were rough, but a great time for learning. Rutgers clinics fought social justice defects and protected our rights without chilling effects. Dombrowski v. Pfister, Tatum v. Laird, some of the cases about which they cared. He did ACLU work and she legal service. Neither paid well, their kids were all nervous. But we learned that the mission was more important than money. Be serious about work, but also be funny. I'd like to share stories of their lives before law, a tale of two fighters and the issues they saw, a world with big problems that would require support from those who were trained to take the battles to court. She was a beatnik, a globe-trotting girl, in search of adventure, finding her place in the world. She went to North Africa, to Russia, to France, until the world changed and offered a chance, not just to the restless dame that would roam, but for searchers and fighters looking for battles back home. Meanwhile, a young man was pursuing his passion, fighting a war in his unique fashion. His war wasn't Korea, it was a war for broad rights. His tactics were Gandhian, pamphlets, sit-ins, and strikes. Dad was a commie, his opponents say so. His FBI file is thick and continues to grow. From Baltimore to Jersey, with feds on his tail, Frank tinkered with justice to balance its scale. They met as reporters, if this ballad is true, while chasing a monkey that escaped from the zoo. They converged on the home of Jersey's mob boss to find the poor monkey who was probably lost. Or maybe the monkey was by will or by fate, a link to bring them together to plan their first date. Rossellini and Bergman at an art movie house, or so Mom has said, we can't confirm from her spouse. They eloped later that year with Grandma in tow. She was so proud of her kids she let everyone know, including the G-men who were trying to find what they were doing, these radical kind. When they moved from New York, neighbors thought they were weird because she wore green stockings and he had a beard. Or so it says in Dad's file the FBI keeps. There might be stuff missing. We'll check WikiLeaks. They moved into Newark, where they both went to school, to study at Rutgers because they thought it was cool to fight for the rights of the poor and aggrieved at a time when so many needed reprieve. Their causes are known to all in this room, and to many not born, their legacy looms. From libraries to highways, from nursing homes into malls, their goal was quite clear: safeguard liberties for us all. Marilyn pioneered the role of the dame. As mother and lawyer, she's still changing the game. She's no shrinking violet when it comes to a fight. She'll never relent until the man does what is right. In personal stuff, Frank keeps more to himself. But in the public arena, well, you've got his book on your shelf. In matters of contract, they prefer bridge over law. You might think conversely, but that's not what we saw. It's a much closer call regarding the courts. In law and in tennis, they like courts of all sorts, with a nod to Seuss. They've also had fun between their battles in court. Martinis and dancing are things they call sport. Actually, Mom did the dancing while Dad did the drinking, but they'd come back together to share in the thinking. They would return to the road with kids on their back, from New York to DC and even further off track. Dad wasn't prone to yells or to hollers, except for one line: Marilyn, pay the $2. But Mom clipped her coupon, secure in the knowledge that public interest law could never pay for our college. Mom has her dancing and Dad has his poker, because neither's a quitter except as a smoker. A circuitous path for these passionate forces who met on the road and continued their courses, which continues today and for many to come, because the battle's not won, and won't end until we've all won. The right to live free by our own life's design, without corporations or government trying to keep us in line. There was Neisser and Hyman and Arthur Kanoy. These were the role models for me as a boy. Ed Lloyd and John Dubin, Penny and Lou. This place has been filled with heroes like you. Fighting for justice in our own special ways, that's what we've all learned from back in those days. Through Abrams, Deutsch, Farmer, Chen, they love it now, they loved it then. May these clinics last forever, writing newer pages, based on lessons learned before, but living, breathing for the ages. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Well, I'm about to bring up the person of the hour. Before I do so, just a moment, it is, I suppose, as good a time as any to confess, although Frank knows this. When I entered Rutgers Law School, and throughout my career, I made one huge mistake. I never took the Constitutional Rights Clinic, which Frank does not remind me of often unless he really wants to make a point. So I did not have Frank formally as a teacher when I was a law student. But in the years since I returned to the faculty, 1987, Frank has been my teacher in so many ways that it is hard to count. He and so many other names that really helped define this place, this institution. Frank, Arthur Kanoy, Willard Heckel, Al Blumrosen, Anna Mae Shepard, the two last who unfortunately we lost within the last year. All those people, more so than places and concrete and things, really define this law school. For those of you who are Trekkies, I'm going to paraphrase from one of my favorite episodes. What you've seen here tonight and heard here tonight, this is the Rutgers way. This is the Rutgers heart. This is the Rutgers soul. This is our way. I also have had the privilege or the challenge of occasionally being on the opposite side of an argument from Frank. As Danita mentioned, she and I and Frank have served for many years on the ACLU National Board. And in fact, there was recently an issue that is near and dear to Frank's heart. That is a matter of some controversy within the ACLU having to do with campaign finance and disclosure rules, in which he and I had, I'll put it politely, contrasting viewpoints. And I learned then, in a much more peaceful way than I think what his litigative adversaries have learned in court. Beware having Frank Askin as your adversary. He has justice as he sees it on his side. Because of the festivities, and my memory will fail me as to who actually won that debate. But it was another learning experience for me. Ladies and gentlemen, friends of Rutgers Law, I say you, Frank Askin.
I'm overwhelmed. Thank you, Nancy Cantor. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Ginny. Thank you, Donita. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Sandy King, for that awesome video. And I think I owe a special thanks to the notorious RBG for her kind and generous words. What I really think of tonight is the scene from Pride of the Yankees, where Lou Gehrig, in his farewell address at Yankee Stadium, says, "I'm the luckiest guy in the world." I've had 50 years getting up every day to get paid to go do what I love to do, and would surely do it for free. And I must acknowledge something. I'm not sure I ever confessed to this before. I owe it all to Marilyn. Let me explain, although Ginny has already probably expressed it all. I'm going to repeat some of what Ginny has said. When I was a kid, I'd always planned to go to law school and be a lawyer. But as a teenager, in my native Jim Crow city of Baltimore, I was a community organizer, fighting against racial segregation in the schools, public recreation, and public accommodation. being for civil rights was not politically correct in the late 40s in J. Edgar Hoover's America. The time I was 18, I was on the FBI Security Index, which was the list of subversives who were to be rounded up in case of national emergency and placed in internment camps. I realized the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover were never going to allow me to become a member of the bar. I dropped out of college after 1 year. Fast forward 10 years. I met Marilyn. We were both newspaper reporters in Bergen County. When she realized my background and my desire to be a lawyer, she started to badger me to go back to college. And nobody can badger like Marilyn. Indeed, if you didn't know she was born in the Bronx, you would think she grew up in Wisconsin. But she taught me to start taking classes in my spare time at CCNY. There was one period I worked days at the Daily Mirror, drove up to City College to take a class in the evening, and then drove to Bergen County to work for the Bergen Record. The time I had completed 2 more years of college and had taken the LSAT, I decided to apply to an evening law school. No law schools would admit me without a degree. Rutgers didn't have an evening program at that time. But a mutual friend took me to lunch with Dean Willard Heckel. Heckel looked at my record, my background. He says, "We'll admit you to Rutgers." I went home and told Marilyn, I said, "How can I be a full-time law student? We're starting a family." She says, "We'll manage." And she pushed me through 3 years of law school as we suffered together. And that's why I say, if it weren't for her, I would not be here today. She was the reason for my being the luckiest guy in the world. I thank her. I want to thank also all of you for being here tonight, for all of you who've contributed to the Frank and Marilyn Askin Clinical Fund. And I want to pay a special thanks to my children who've contributed part of their inheritance to the Frank and Marilyn Askin Clinical Fund. My son Steve, my son Jonathan, my son Danny, my daughter Andrea, and my grandchildren, Jacob and Sammy. And Jacob, I want to tell you, is going to continue the Askin tradition at Rutgers in the fall when he enrolls at Rutgers College in New Brunswick. Thank you all so much for this overwhelming occasion. I thank you.
This evening will certainly go down in the history of this law school as one of the signal moments. And although, with much regret, there will soon come a time in which we do not see Frank on a daily basis, he will be here guiding our work throughout. As Frank mentioned, he and Marilyn have not only dedicated their efforts, their heart, their professional life to the law school, they have also established the Frank and Marilyn Askin Endowed Fund for Clinical Legal Education. And through the years, they have inspired alumni to give with their own substantial matching contributions. That fund now stands at $800,000, generating income each year to support clinical programs. So I would be remiss if I did not invite you to consider honoring them by bringing this fund to maybe an even $1 million, and the details of that are on the back of your program. So now dessert is on the table, coffee and tea are at the side, so please stay around and greet your friends and colleagues and family. And let us one more time give a round of applause to Frank and Marilyn Askin.